honestly think that you know how damage works? Well, I, random internet guy, is here to tell you, no, you have no idea. I thought that I did, but I'm warning you, don't make the same mistake as I did. Once you peek into the rabbit hole, you will never make it out alive. There are an endless slew of buts and actuallys with no explanation or reason. Why does galvanized aptitude stack multiplicatively on the beta core, but not on the fucking boltor? That is some bullshit. Okay, how about I explain the fundamentals and then we can talk about the exceptions. Let's start with the single most important aspect of damage scaling in the game. Let's start with the difference between additive and multiplicative damage. Simply put, when you have two buffs of the same type such as serration and heavy caliber, your damage output is increased by the sum of their values. On the other hand, if you have two buffs of two different types, such as damage with serration and elemental damage with hellfire, you have to multiply their values instead, hence multiplicative. We'll keep coming back to this, but for now, multiplicative good, additive bad. Something we will keep coming back to as well is base damage, and it's not this. It's the combined value of the innate damage types of the weapon, which most commonly is slash, impact and puncture. They may also have some elemental damage types, however. Just to be abundantly clear then, damage and base damage are two very different things, okay? Good, moving on. What actually happens when you add serration to your Soma Prime? The obvious answer is that you get more damage, but that's clearly not what I'm getting at here. You see how these numbers have increased? I know I just said your base damage is the sum of these numbers, but that stops being true when you add mods to the weapon. We have increased the damage of the weapon by 165%, but we have not changed the base damage, and that is incredibly important. Elemental damage is the most similar to damage. Hellfire will add 90% of the base damage as heat damage. It scales additively with itself, but multiplicatively with damage. This is why something like Hellfire plus Serration will result in higher damage output compared to something like Serration plus Heavy Caliber, which just so happens to be a pretty bad mod overall. As you probably already know, elements can also be combined, but you might struggle to understand in which order. It goes as follows, which means that these mods will combine even though these are closer to one another on the modding screen. Physical damage is a bit finicky. It stacks additively with elemental damage and multiplicatively with damage. Unlike elemental mods that adds 90% of the base damage as extra elemental damage, physical damage mods increases the specific stat on that weapon. That means that if you add more slash to a weapon that didn't have any to begin with, you're adding nothing. Me crit, me big red, me big muscle, me crit, me do, me big stupid. Alright, listen very carefully. The color of the number means nothing. Only the numerical value and the frequency of which you can produce aforementioned numbers. Can you make it red crit? No, I can't. It's a status build, you uncultured hooligan. It's okay. Now, strictly speaking, critical scales multiplicatively with everything, and please note that the critical damage already includes the baseline 1 times damage. So critting on a 100 damage hit with a 2.2 critical damage multiplier will result in a 220 damage critical hit and not a 320. Look, the value of critical chance and critical damage is the same essentially. Adding 50% critical chance is the same as adding 50% critical damage. So if you can only add one of them, you must go for the one you have the least amount of already, which is almost always going to be critical damage. Hey, wait, okay, hold on. I didn't explain this very well in the video, but basically, I said you should add the one you have the least of, unless, as you can see here, we have 150% critical chance and 100% critical damage. This one is 50% greater, so you should add critical damage unless the critical chance buff you have is 50% greater than the critical damage buff you would have added. So it's relative to what you already have on the weapon. My bad. Though it has to be mentioned that you can actually exceed 100% critical chance. With 120% critical chance, you will apply your critical damage multiplier to your damage output, but you'll also have a 20% chance to add another critical damage multiplier to your damage output. You don't keep multiplying your damage output each time, you just add your critical damage multiplier on top whenever you crit. Critical scales of the inherent critical chance and critical damage on the weapon. This means that adding 200% critical chance on the Soma Prime will give you 90% chance to crit. In order to find out how much your critical increases your damage output, you must multiply your critical chance by your inherent critical chance and then multiply that by your critical damage multiplier minus 1. You can then compare this to your damage and elemental damage. Adding to the type of buff that is the lowest will yield the greatest increase to your damage output. Fire rate seems as though it would be pretty self-evident, but once you start factoring in reload time and magazine capacity, it gets complicated. Luckily, your spreadsheet overlord is here to save the day. I'll just leave it in the description. MultiShot. It stacks multiplicatively with everything except itself, of course. And finally, punch through is fairly simple as well, though quite underrated. Hitting one additional target is essentially 100% more damage output. Do be warned that some weapons like the Ignis Wraith, which has punch through built into the weapon, but for some reason that isn't stated anywhere. So then, how can you tell which weapons has built-in punch through? Well, it's quite simple actually, you just have to test them one by one. But more on that later. Let's take a look at the melee only mechanic, follow through. When you melee attack, you draw a hitbox in front of you. Each melee attack can hit multiple targets but deals reduced damage with every subsequent hit. Hammers have 40% follow through, which means that by the time you get to your third target, you will only deal 16% of your damage output. You can really only hit one target at a time with hammers, so building for range is pointless. On the other hand, daggers have a 90% follow through, which means that the third target takes 81% of your damage output and the ninth target still takes 34%. So keep in mind that certain melee weapons are essentially single target. You will remember me neatly skipping over status, I'm sure. Well, buckle up because things are about to get complicated. Like critical chance, status chance scales off the inherent status chance instead of straight up offering 90%. This is the chance of proccing any status effect on an enemy when you hit them. It is worth noting that with MultiShot you have multiple chances of 19% to proc a status effect. With Galvanized Chamber you have an average of 33%. Now, status chance can exceed 100%, at which point you will be guaranteed one status proc and you may get another one on that same bullet, and you can get the same status effect twice. Please note that status procs and status damage is two different things. Certain enemies take more or less damage against certain types of damage, but you do not need to get a status proc in order to deal status damage. If you have heat damage on your weapon, then you are always dealing heat damage with that weapon, but the damage increase against that specific enemy only goes for the heat damage on your weapon and not the total damage output. Hey, whoa, I can't believe that I forgot to mention this, but I didn't talk about which status effects will trigger when. It's actually quite simple. For example, here we have Hellfire on this weapon, which means that 47% of the damage is heat damage, and that means that we have a 47% chance to trigger heat as a status proc. Certain status effects deals damage over time, such as Slash, Heat, Toxin, Electricity, and Gas. Slash has its damage reduced by armor the same as all other damage types, but its status proc, Bleed, will bypass it, dealing 35% of the initial attack every second for 5 seconds for a total of 175% of the total damage output and not only the Slash portion. Toxin bypasses shields and deals 50% damage per second for 5 seconds for a total of 250% of the initial hit. Electricity deals 50% of the damage of the initial hit for 5 seconds to all enemies in a 3 meter radius. Gas also deals 50% of the initial hit for 5 seconds, but in a 3 meter radius. Applying additional stacks of gas just increases the radius up to 6 meters instead of adding more gas procs, but the gas persists after the target dies. Before I get into heat, I want to mention the type of damage I skipped earlier, and that is faction damage. With Prime mods you get 55% faction damage, which stacks multiplicatively with everything, which is already solid. But they have their effect applied twice with damage over time effects, first on the initial hit and then with every damage tick. Let's say you strike an enemy for 100 damage and then bleed them for 175. That is a total of 275. Now let's imagine that you had a faction mod equipped. You deal 155 and then 420 for a total of 575, which is actually a 109% more damage than you would otherwise have dealt. Maybe now you can understand why I be pulling out me hair when Barrow arrives with the primed Bane mods and people starts going "Prime disappointment" in chat. Anyways, back to heat. This status proc functions differently than the other damage over time effects. Normally each proc is on its own timer, but not here. Causing a heat proc on an enemy already affected by a heat proc will cause the entire stack to be refreshed. But you might say, doesn't that mean that you can stack damage forever on a target? Well, yes it does. But not only that. Remember the thing about faction damage we just talked about, double dipping and all? Well, the only thing more gratifying than double dipping is triple dipping. Let's try the former thought experiment again, but with heat this time. Without faction mods you deal 100 damage and then burn them for 250 for a total of 350. With 2 faction mods, you deal 210 damage and then burn them for 1102 for a total of 1302 damage. That is a lot of damage. But how do you triple dip? First you proc heat with your offhand weapon, your primer, and then you start stacking heat with your main weapon. Armor do get in the way of this strat, but if you are stripping armor anyways, then it's heat all the way. I think all of you know how good viral is, but otherwise I'm about to blow your mind. Even a single proc of viral causes any damage against the enemy's health to be doubled, and it may stack up to 10 times, adding 25% each stack. And yes, it does stack multiplicatively with everything. You are giving up on 325% of your damage output by not priming the enemies with your offhand. So far, I've been using mods as examples, but another source might as well be arcanes. And yes, mods and arcanes can stack additively with one another. Yet another source of buffs for your weapons might come in the form of Warframe Abilities, which by far is the most inconsistent. I mean, come on, you couldn't tell me which is which. We'll just have to go through them one by one. First up we have Chroma with Elemental Ward, well actually. I don't know what this means because it doesn't seem to do anything. Luckily, we do have Vex Armor, which is additive to damage. You might not have expected Gara to be here, but her Mass Vetrify actually causes enemies increased damage vulnerability once they are fully vetrified. Damage vulnerability works almost like viral, except it also affects shields and stacks multiplicatively with viral itself. At 10 stacks of viral and 300% ability strength, that is a 12 times damage increase. Garuda gains increased damage when she kills, and it stacks multiplicatively with everything. Gara's Redline also belongs here. Weapons with slow fire rate and long reload times greatly benefit from this. It does exactly what it says on the tin. Grendel's Nourish adds elemental damage. This is an elemental damage buff, so it stacks additively with elemental damage from mods and arcanes. Gaia's
Cathode
Gaia's Cathode Grace adds critical in the form of critical chance, which stacks additively with the buffs of the same type. Ivara both have Navigator and Prowl. The increase on Navigator is multiplicative, and the headshot multi on Prowl stacks additively with other headshot buffs. Mesha's Shooting Gallery adds a small amount of damage to her weapons, which stacks additively with other damage buffs. Mirage yet again has 2 damage buffs, Hall of Mirrors and Eclipse. Let's start with Eclipse. Assuming that you are standing in the light, you will be rewarded with the Mirage damage type, which stacks multiplicatively with everything. Now interestingly enough, the clone steals a percentage of your damage. So if your damage is increased by Eclipse, that means that Nova's Molecular Prime actually, in spite of this not being stated on the ability, causes 100% damage vulnerability on the enemies, and this is regardless of your ability strength. Nyx's Absorb adds a tiny amount of weapon damage. I couldn't for the life of me tell if it was additive or multiplicative, but it is such a tiny amount anyways, so it doesn't really matter. Octavia's Amp, because Octavia definitely needed more utility, adds damage which scales additively with other damage buffs. Saren's Toxic Lash is a bit strange actually. It adds extra elemental damage. This means that whenever you damage an enemy, they also take 30% of that as extra toxin damage and suffer a toxin proc as well. So it does actually stack multiplicatively with everything, even your other elemental buffs. It won't even combine with the other elements. Sevagoth's Reap has a small damage vulnerability. And then Warben's passive is so pathetic I can barely be fucked to talk about it, but it stacks multiplicatively. The fact that even a single person thought that this 0.25 times increase warranted moving him up on the tier list, it baffles me. Varuna's Round of the Na is greatly underrated. Seriously, look at that! First up, it guarantees 1 bleed proc with every hit, and its critical damage is total. So even if you only have a 1.1 critical damage multiplier on your weapon itself, you still have 6 times critical damage multi. Wisp Breed Surge apparently doesn't increase your damage at all? Zephyr's passive gives her critical chance that scales additively. But did you know that enemies caught in her tornadoes takes 3 times as much damage from critical hits? Because I didn't know that. That seems like pertinent information. Sure, it says that I can shoot the enemies for more damage, but in actuality I can just shoot the tornadoes and deal damage to all enemies caught in it, who also take status procs and 200% more damage from critical hits. DE! Rhino's Roar is once again different. It increases the damage of most sources, including your abilities but excluding your amps. Harrow has both Penance and Covenant. Penance is pretty self-evident, again use the formula. Covenant stacks additively with your critical chance. Sako has the second extra elemental ability in the game with Sata's Whisper. This one has void damage. Something else setting it apart from Toxic Lash is how it procs status, using the status chance on the weapon to determine when a void proc can occur, but separate from the chance of the rest of your status effects proccing. Wukong's Celestial Twin will deal 3 times the weapon damage output, so multiplicatively. Equinox Rest and Rage scales multiplicatively with everything, as it is basically a damage vulnerability. Valkyr's Paralysis exists. Next, we will cover Yareli's Sea Snares and Nesha's Blazing Chakram, as they both has damage vulnerability and both skills equally with ability strength. And I can already hear you typing away, actually. Yareli's Sea Snares starts at 200% vulnerability at 100% ability strength and gains 1 vulnerability with every ability strength. And wait, that's not how ability stacks with ability strength, is it now? Enemies always have at least 100% damage vulnerability. Right, that's just common sense. Enemies take 100% of the damage they take. The initial 100% is included in Yarelia's damage description, while Nesha only shows the vulnerability over 100%. I couldn't tell you why. Finally, I saved the best for last, Banshee's Sonar. This ability is basically an insanely powerful damage vulnerability which only affects a certain area of the enemy, though that area is pretty damn forgiving. But this ability can do something which no other ability can. It can stack with itself, multiplicatively. Okay, just real fast, let's go over the Augment Mods and determine if they are additive or multiplicative. Fireball Frenzy, additive to your elemental damage and it will combine with your elemental mods. Duality is multiplicative. Furious Javelin is additive to your damage. Biting Frost is additive to your critical chance and critical damage. Freezing Force is additive to your elemental damage and it will combine with your elemental mods. Blood Force is obviously additive. Thermal Transfer is additive to your elemental damage and it will combine with the elemental mods. Empowered Quiver is additive, powerful but additive. Rift Torment is additive. Ballistic Bullseye is total. Okay, I guess I should explain. Total buffs are added after you multiply your inherent critical chance with your critical chance buffs, which means that with this augment you will at the very least always deal yellow crits with a 50% chance to deal orange crits. Hall of Maleficence, additive. Teeming Vigilance, additive. Smite Infusion, additive. Thrall Pact, additive. Venom Dose, additive. Beguiling Lantern, multiplicative. Champion's Blessing, additive. Shock Trooper, additive, and it will combine with the elemental mods. Critical Surge, additive. Primal Rage, additive. And just a quick aside before I go nuclear. Some abilities like Gara's Shatter Lash and Korra's Whipclaw are pseudo exalted, which means they benefit from the mods on your melee weapon. Not the weapon, just the mods themselves. Oh boy, before we can finish this 8-page script off, let's go over these stupid, nonsensical interactions. Condition Overload adds significantly less damage on the Glaive Prime when using a heavy attack. Don't get me wrong, it would be ridiculously overpowered if you could use Condition Overload on the Glaive, but okay, so that's a problem. How do we fix this? Do we A. Nerf the Glaive, B. Nerf Condition Overload, C. Make Condition Overload unplayable on throwable weapons, or D. Cause one of the most used mods on one of the most used weapons to have significantly less effect and then tell nobody about it? Fuck off, seriously. Arcane Avenger adds total critical chance even though it clearly says increased. Why the fuck does Ballistic Bullseye proc on every hit on the Cedo's alternate fire? And then this mod. Thank you, Blessing, I guess bless you for going through the pain of testing every weapon in this entire game. There are things in this game that might or might not work, and the only way for players to realize is to manually test every piece of content, watch the damage numbers and do the calculations. Come on then, tell me this is a bug. I fucking dare you. It doesn't even come close to working on half of the weapons, and it's not even that it's either additive or multiplicative. No, it's always multiplicative, but with a different factor. Okay, so the Acaplasmor, this plasma cannon, this giant AoE weapon, you will increase your damage output by 100% for every 40% on this mod, or I guess for every status effect on the enemy. But on this single target weapon, the Daikun, you only get 1.5% damage per status effect affecting the enemy. That makes absolutely no fucking sense. How about you fix the mod that's supposed to work only on direct damage, you know, single target weapons, instead of nerfing ammo and adding back self damage, you goddamn degenerates.